Okay, that should be good for that. All right. In my very first video, I'm going to be covering the creepypasta Abandoned by Disney, written by Slimebeast, also known as Christopher Howard Wolf. Now, I never had looked into the author of this story before, but he's done a lot more than I had assumed, I guess. He is an indie game developer as well, and he's written a couple other stories, so go check him out if you're interested. Abandoned by Disney is the very first creepypasta I was ever introduced to, and it terrified me back in the day. This was written in May 20th of 2013, but I believe I did not find it, or I was not introduced to it until later in 2014, I want to say. So, yeah, I think it's a pretty short story. So I think what I'm going to do here is read it out loud to you all and give my commentary as I go through. I find this story very entertaining. This is one of my favorite, if not my very most favorite creepypasta of all time, and I think you all will like it as well. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, Abandoned by Disney by Slimebeast. Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real, live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate. And there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That is a wild accusation, just because people live in the Bahamas. Okay, that's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because of foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt those reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. Near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North California, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character Mowgli, then you might better remember the story Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd know it as the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened/pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney brought up a ton of high-priced land for the project. There was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home had just been constructed and was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it the Mickey Mouse Highway. There was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. They showed the concept art. This gigantic Indian palace surrounded by the jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear. Well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but also somewhat xenophobic area of the southern USA. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. The houses were razed, the land was cleared. There wasn't a damn thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort from the beginning. But some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. So anyways, Treasure Island, the Bahamas, Disney sunk those millions in and then split. Same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Okay, pause here. When I first heard this story, I was probably, I think, not very old. I think 9 years old. And I remember I knew the whole thing couldn't be true, but I thought a good portion of it was probably true. And I remember thinking that this whole idea that it was, it's just another one of these abandoned places. You hear about them all the time. I mean, I guess not all the time, but they're well known enough. There are companies that have built locations and then completely abandoned them. That is not really out of the question. So, young me, I assumed that Mowgli's Palace was a real place. I assumed that some guy even explored it, probably, which we'll see in a little bit. I mean, as you all know, Disney urban exploring is very interesting, and it's a very real thing. So I always assumed when I was younger that a good portion of the story was true, at least. And when we see stuff later, I also assumed there was a good chance that the whole story was true and just not supernatural. But you'll see. Anyways, let's see. Same thing happened at Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irritated tourists. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down, and nobody knew what the hell to think. They were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I lived maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so really, I only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy shit he found in there. Stuff just left behind, things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there just felt as angry about Treasure Island as folks here did about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stocks into local waters when they closed, including sharks. Okay, pause again. Disney has done some pretty sketchy things with their, with their enclosure animals in the past. So this was another point where I like these kind of details to young me, and even to me now. These details are convincing and, fairly real. I like this world building. This is a very short story, by the way. I encourage you all to look it up yourselves as well. I know I'm reading the whole thing right now, but it's concise. It gets all this world building in and convinces me of the reality we're in without, taking 50 pages to do it. This is probably like a 20-minute read total. Okay, anyways, back to this story. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? What I'm getting at is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years had passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploring at Mowgli's Palace, take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time getting there, because honestly, it took me another year after that, I first found Treasure Island articles to get around. Oh, excuse me, sorry. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly, it took me another year after I first found Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place that had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they had all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there laughing at their embarrassment, you know. Oh, my apologies again. They wouldn't be rather lauding their embarrassment, you know. Recently, I learned that the corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search sites, from search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably not that nobody spoke of the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. Okay, also very interesting. Yeah, I don't think I need to explain to you that this kind of stuff does happen in real life, and, you know, just kind of adds to this very light level, realistic conspiracy kind of that's going on. At this point, it's barely even a conspiracy. It's just, you know, Disney has built a place and they regret it. It was a waste of money for them and they backed out and they just want to cover up their little mistake. Okay. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old as hell map I'd received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who had recently been to Disney World. And I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was quote-unquote recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it months into my research, and even then it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin and my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me, made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where would I find Mowgli's..." It cuts off there. The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth, tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort, tremendous, monolithic wooden gates whose supports to either side looked like they must have been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal and some random scrap with the hand-painted letters scrawled in black, "Abandoned by Disney." Clearly the handiwork of some local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open to walk through, but not drive, so grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just as overgrown as the entry. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood in their own stinking, bug-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxiously tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotting wood and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of assorted debris, chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was the statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave towards no one, staring into empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird shit covered whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the doors, or the gaping maw where they had been, someone had once again painted "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about all the awesome stuff I found inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, and full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. Inside of the buildings was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people had stolen the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, giant fake trees, they were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified every step like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was, as you'd imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances and space. No expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. Man. Okay, pause again. This description is not something I appreciated when I was younger. Granted, when I very, very first heard the story, it was retold by a friend, or kind of friend, on I think it was a youth trip. It was like a fall church youth trip, and a group of guys were telling scary stories, and one of them tried his own rendition of Abandoned by Disney. I later found the original story and read it for myself like a year later, but at the time all I had to go off of was his very poor rendition of it. So this all comes off a lot more impressive to me, even though I've read the original story before generally, and sadly the one I remember more is the one that my friend told me back then. Anyways, back to the story. I'm really enjoying this so far, by the way. I forgot how well written a lot of this is, how descriptive and how detailed this guy can be. Really nice job, Christopher Howard Wolf. All right. Let's see. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space, hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat. As I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movement were so slow and small that it was impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one of them from swinging by clutching it in my fist and then carefully letting go. But within seconds, it started to swing once more. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of the place. Just like the Treasure Island resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about a half-inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't even stay there very long. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks and the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I went in there, all dripped or leaked or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off long, long ago. That is a pretty unsettling detail. Like, they abandoned it, but they didn't even take the time to, shut off the essentials, like water. That would be like one of the first things you do. Even before you pack up and leave, you're shutting off the water. But yeah, there were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have to go look through all of them. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really heard a quiet conversation coming out. Though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing, echoing in the silence, or just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on the mind. This is what it sounded like. 1. I didn't believe it. 2. Short, unknown reply. 1. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. 2. Your father told you. 1. Unknown reply, or possibly just weeping. I know. That sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced, why I thought there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed up in there that probably would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted the trip up. As I locked the door, as I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I had apparently missed, something that would give me at least one thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on the pedestal right in the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on onto the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer to get the detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned and slithered off the pedestal across the grass and into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head, long, disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. I should have known. I read about the sharks at Treasure Isle, and I should have known they'd done this. Okay, I will say, it's pretty funny that this place has been abandoned for like years, and he still thinks it's like, since the reptile house is on the map, that it makes sense that they release their animals there. Like, that's proof because there's a snake outside the reptile house after years. Like the animals would escape from their enclosures and then just like choose to live there in the same spot. Anyways, not a big deal. I was dumbfounded and utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, towards the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I wasn't taking any chances and backed my way into the building. It took a few deep breaths and slaps to my own face to get myself in the right head again after that. I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet or haul myself onto a desk of questionable reliability. I had seen some stairs at the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from any of the buildings to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall once again, painted with "Abandoned by Disney" motto that I had become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep at least somewhat clean. The stairway led downward, below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, read, "Mascots only, thank you." This perked up my spirits a little bit for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall. Something nobody else had apparently thought of or hadn't been able to do at the time. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcome change from the rest of the building I'd seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads, pens, and there were clocks. even a punch-in clock on the wall, complete with filled-out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static-filled television and long, rotted-out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything is left in the state of an evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways in the mascot's only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered, and almost melded with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real rotting crimson and floor covering. Everything was just sort of squishy. Anything wood disintegrated into mush when I applied the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell to moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dank, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where the costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping sound and the door creaked slowly open. Inside the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch on the wall by the door, but there was nothing. Okay, pause. After this point, I'm just going to read through the rest of the story. I think it's almost done, and this is like the best part. But you really came to explore an abandoned building without bringing a flashlight, man? Really? That's a bold move, honestly. I mean, he's smart enough to use his camera flash, but still. Like, I know it's daytime and all, but he said it's like the sun is setting. Come on, man. Again, I don't think this is really a writing flaw. I think this is, a flaw of the character within the story. Everything so far is very well written, and I enjoy it very much. Anyways, let's see. Inside the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my senses of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. Interesting. It took only a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was going to just keep getting brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it would reach a critical stage, the lights dimmed and steadied. The room was exactly as I had pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together, like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and quote-unquote native clothes on the hangers towards the back. What I found odd, what I wanted to photograph right away, was a Mickey Mouse costume at the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back in the center of the room like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse, black where he should be white and white where he should be black. His normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the wall, upward angles, downward angles, and side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces and some with plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot, just one of the bedraggled characters' heads onto the slick, grimy floor. As I reached for the headpiece of Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there, between my shoes, was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head, shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know. I had to, for any number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. I'd need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start, that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, that photonegative opposite Mickey, in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet, the Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside it, stood there at the center of the room, its fake face, just starting directly at me as I mumbled "no" over and over. With shaking hands, a violent thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift up the camera and aim it at the opposite creature, now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera's screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey Mouse costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels started to spread, marring the screen, wherever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went black and quiet, broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey," it said in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "Want to see my head come off?" It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits into the neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and fresh flesh, only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. "Abandoned by God." I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. I ran from that place, fled for my sanity, if not my very life. I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out. And that was Abandoned by Disney. Pretty great, if you ask me. It didn't take too long to read. That was very enjoyable. I often myself, I listen to a lot of read-throughs of creepypastas. That's usually my preferred form of consuming them. So hopefully this was enjoyable to somebody who also enjoys that. And for me, it was really nice to try reading one for a change. And reading aloud. I generally don't enjoy reading aloud. I stumble over my words a lot. I know everybody does. But I don't think I'm going to do any heavy editing on this. I prefer videos without many cuts. And for me personally, it doesn't bother me to hear somebody stumble over their words and correct themselves. So hopefully you all feel the same. Hopefully that wasn't off-putting or anything. And hopefully it was very enjoyable. So this will be the first real video on my channel, the first, actually topical one. The other two videos are just faith gameplay. I decided to leave them up, but they're not good videos, not at all really. Maybe someday I'll come back with a video on faith that actually does it justice. In the meantime, I will get this put out, and next up, I would like to do I'd like to cover some more creepypastas in the future, but this one's just great. I love all of the writing. I really, really enjoy the detail and description. The way he was describing the wreckage of the area was very visceral, it sparks pictures in my mind just as I read it, as I think about it. And I love that in writing. And like I said before, this is so short. This is incredibly short, but it doesn't feel like it really. Like it feels like a whole experience in my head. And, you know, say what you will, this story is pretty impactful. It is one of the most famous creepypastas, and one that anyone familiar with internet horror probably recognizes. And I think it definitely deserves it myself. Great job, Slimebeast. I have not read any of his other stories, but just doing like some brief, you know, looking over his other releases over the years. I'm definitely going to look into some of the other stuff he's done, because wow, this is way better than I remembered, and I appreciate it so much more. There were several moments throughout the story that it genuinely gave me chills, like several times just reading it. In a lot of his scene descriptions, in a lot of his emotional responses, they seem pretty accurate. I think this would make a really, really cool found footage short film. I don't think it needs a full movie, not even close, especially with the length of this, but a short film would be awesome. I have never looked into that, but now that I have, I will, because that would be incredible. And it totally fits. I mean, he already has a camera there. He's there to do some Disney urban exploring, which is already a super interesting topic on its own, and which that is actually what inspired me to come back to this and look at it again. I love that stuff, and it would make an amazing short film. One critique that gets slammed at a lot of found footage stuff that I hear quite often is, why do they keep filming? Like, what's the drive? And I always used that critique myself until I played the first Outlast game, where I realized, when a camera is all you have, it kind of becomes your one lifeline. Like your proof when you get out of this, and kind of like you're like a digital friend. Like, you can look through the lens and it's not all you experiencing it, it's you and the you inside the camera. It kind of creates a companion there, even though it's just machinery. And it's just genius. For this, it really makes sense as well, and it's really interesting that at the end there, it infects his camera. His one companion in that scene is destroyed, and he can never, he can't even prove that he was there beyond just this story, which is proof enough for me. I will not be visiting Mowgli's palace myself, and I think I'll be good for the rest of my life. Anyways, I know I kind of did this video in a weird order. I know I started talking about future video ideas immediately after I finished, and then kind of gave my opinion afterwards. But, this is my first video. It is what it is. I don't really want to do any huge editing. I like unedited projects. I find it much more engaging and appealing to myself. And hopefully you all feel the same way. And hopefully the YouTube algorithm knows that you feel that way and gives you this video because you feel that way. So I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you all go looking for Mowgli's Palace. Stay safe out there. God be with you all. And goodbye. Thank you for watching.